I go ahead and record. So tonight we're very pleased to have Christopher Lee Maines, who's a poet, a scholar, and an educator. Christopher's work has Christopher's work has appeared in Louisiana History, the Southwestern Review, and Carville, Remembering Leprosy in America. So we're very pleased to have him, and he's going to be reading tonight from his most recent publication, Naming the Leper. So very excited about that. So Christopher, take it away.
Yes, and these poems that I wrote are about my relatives. 5 of my relatives were incarcerated in the National Leprosarium with what was then called leprosy. It is now called Hansen's disease. My relatives were diagnosed and in Carville between 1919, and then the last to die was in 1977. And so this book takes those 5 stories and kind of weaves it together. My family is extremely fortunate in that we have our relatives, their letters that they wrote to people on the outside. And we have a little over 200 letters that are currently archived at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. And so many of the poems in this collection were based on those letters, but I also used medical records and other documents. So I'm not going to talk that much between poems. I'm going to pretty much let the poems speak for themselves. So I'll read 2 or 3 poems, and then every now and then I'll interject something. The first 2 poems that I'll read tonight talk about the myths of leprosy, and we'll give you a little bit of the facts about Carville and the leprosarium, and also about some of the myths and stories of how I learned about the disease. So, tall tales grow limbs, my mother said. In the beginning, the word lived among us, an American mindset, public health policy, and finally flesh. But I was nursing, she said, when it first learned to hiss and move down transoms over my crib. Adapted to syllables that had breath and could rattle the underbelly of particulars from cattle milk which we sipped. No, that can't be it. It must have come from the fish, become the word Turville choked on when he swallowed the fish bone that split his esophagus. At the same time, Carville was said to breed ostriches, and the word took on feathers before anyone corrected it. In the name of my kin, I listened, changed skins, and grew stilts, to reach the height of the tallest tree where their spirits nested, and the word dwelt in the wind. The Book of Names. These are the children of Turville and Lucy by order of birth. Edmond, Norbert, Charlie, Marie, Albert, and Amélie. This is the order they died. Charlie, Norbert, Edmond, Amélie, Marie, and Albert. These are the children of Edmond and Claire, Leonide and Wilbert. This is the order they died, Wilbert and Leonide. These are the names of the women who told my mother the family stories, Sadie Morgan Spencer and Zenobia Racely. These are the last names of the doctors who participated in Norbert, Edmond, Amélie, Marie, and Albert's incarcerations. Mouton, Sabatier, Johns, Denny, Mingus, Fadgett, and Johnson. These are the names of the 1917 Surgeon General and the Secretary of the Treasury, Rupert Blue, and William Gibbs McAdoo, who carried out Public Law 64299. These are the names Norbert Edmond and Amelie chose in confinement: James Jackson, Gabe Michael, and Emily Michael. This is the place Norbert, Edmond, Amelie, Marie, and Albert were forced to live and to die. United States Marine Hospital, number 66, otherwise known as Carville. Public law. These were the procedures concerning leprosy eruptions and ostrich forms in 1917. When a diagnosis was suspected in accordance with paragraph 32.86, the patient in question could not be in contact with people on the street and in the stores. And if the diagnosis was confirmed, a patient had to volunteer admittance to Carville. The way ostrich feathers are clipped begins at 6 months old, when the bird is as tall as its parents, has a curved neck, small head, humped back, paddled toes, and an ungainly walk. From that time forth, every 6 months, the feathers are clipped and sold. At 8 feet tall, an ostrich's single leap covers 25 feet. Public health employees at Carville earned additional pay for working with lepers, though by 1906, the medical community believed it to be the least contagious of all diseases. These were the patients never compelled to live under armed guard, without the right to vote, to marry, or to live where they might. Those with smallpox and tuberculosis. Fragments from the papers of Norbert and Edmond Landry. 1, September 11th, 1924. Mornings become a way of life, a calling back, family tried. I'm grinding my teeth each night and can't stop. The knowing afterwards. Norbert's doctor's notes, not leprosy, but pulmonary tuberculosis. Apparatus, married, no. Numerous discrete nodules on face and lobes, ulcers on thighs, unable to walk, acid-fast stains, race, white. 2, August 8th, 1919. Without proof, who will dream us awake? Have something at least belong to the truth of the place. Show the world my letter. When I write to one, it will count for all. Swollen are the days between writing in line and receiving a response. By the way, I am only half myself. 3, Saturday morning, undated. The canned chicken made us sick. I can't keep even milk down. My feet and legs are engorged. I have a gland under my arm the size of a head. Everything in me wants out, and there's really no news except that. And the next set of poems are actually written as letters. Dear folks, I don't know myself. In here, they don't use names. On any given day, I can be called Cicero, Albert, or James Jackson. I wish you could see me. I've changed. I've grown a mustache and wear a derby, and I've tanned. It's all about getting in the dirt and sweating the sickness out. Every time I do, I feel like a new man. Dear Claire, I don't expect you to understand. Here I am human again, less a leper today than I've been. It is beautiful New Orleans, its lakes knee deep in the Mississippi, reflections distorted, with its strange personifications of humans spilled on the pavement. Folks, an old fellow we are watching die since Sunday has been talking out his head and having convulsions. That flies aren't enough, we are raising our hands in prayer, but pray as we must for mercy. I cannot ask the Lord to cure me. I am just trying to adjust to the dead of the place, like Lazarus in his tomb before he could tell what he had seen. I am breathing too much in a cell that has rats, wide planked floors, and dreams spent on looper clips. Too much smelling pine. What is the price of the colors you sent? By the way, the old man died. There is a letter in my family's collection that talks about the flood of 1927. And my great-grandfather, who was in Carville at the time, Carville is right next to the dam for the Mississippi. And so my great-grandfather was worried that in order to save other towns, they might let the levee break, because his fear was they were lepers, who would care? And at the time, he was told, you know, don't worry, you have nothing to fear. But at the same time, there were boats in front of the big house, the plantation house that Carville sat on, the land. There were boats in front of the big house that were there specifically to take the doctors if the levee did break, but not the patients. So his fears were, you know, somewhat justified. So these next letters talk about that. Dear folks, the river situation is worse. The levee has become indifferent, and I am afraid the rest of the world with it. Things are not good here. Carville is pregnant with a loneliness that startles me off of my seat sometimes. I've tried to scream, but nothing ever comes out except tears. There was a murder here last week. One patient killed another. And now with the levee to break, well, I don't think I can stand it. I will not be killed a leper. Oh, the nuns offer their blessings and tell me not to worry, but prayer replaces people here. Religion is a pastime thought interrupts. What else would the saints do if they didn't have a sinner to forgive or a leper to cure? The nuns tell me to keep my faith, trust, but I don't know. Tell Claire the authorities have a boat in front of the big house for their use. The last poem I'll read, I had the opportunity, my great-grandmother, Claire, was always afraid for some reason, and we don't know why, that her husband's casket was affected by a flood in our hometown. After my great-grandfather Edmond died in Carville in 1932, his body, his remains, were sent to New Iberia, Louisiana. And for whatever reason, my great-grandmother assumed that the casket was just in water because of a flood. And maybe that was her guilt, maybe that was, who knows. And my great-grandmother had requested that the casket, that the burial plot be exhumed and basically rinsed out of the water, and my great-grandfather reburied. Well, my great-grandmother died in 1982, but in 2003, my family got a call from the funeral home saying they were doing it that day. They were exhuming the body and, you know, fixing the grave. And so my grandmother and I went to the grave. And so this poem is about that. Remains. 1. It was 2003 when Edmond's body was exhumed. To save him from the water, Claire worried had his soul in unrest. Of course, his body was wet, not from water, but from death. Skin becomes paste. They opened his grave and 71 years brushed my face. His skull was hidden by a piece of wood, so opaque that the timber resembled a shawl, sunken into the haunt of his nose, mouth, eyes, lips. My grandmother Leonide and I watched as his casket fell apart, the word leper written on top of it. 2. In the kitchen, we exhumed his body a second time over smoke from tea with lemon. What Edmond knows, death, its brightness, shoveled in a garbage bag, silent. So those are my poems, Naming the Leper, LSU Press. And I think we have a few minutes more, so if you have questions or anything, I'll be happy to answer.
I've muted everybody. So if you want to ask a question.
So all right, thank you. Thank you. Am I mute? Can you hear me?
Yeah, Hester, go ahead.
You know, I'm reading Cicely Tyson's story. Real quickly, I just want to say to you, I don't know why your poems affect me the way they do. There's a certain sadness, but yet there's a power or spirit for me to say those words because I'm feeling connected, I guess. And just like with Cicely, she said she would read something over again until it becomes part of her skin. And while you were reading, I just empathize. What is it? Say it for me. Yes. And I ache. And wow. I just don't know what else to say. And I'm saying to myself, when is he gonna let me hurry up and let me read this for him? I mean, voice over it, however. But it's beautiful though, with all of that negative, all of the bad things, it's the beauty of it is you having the memories and the letters, because all of that could have been washed away. So that's the beauty of what you're doing, is that you got it, and you got it, you know, and it's so close to your heart. So I just want to say that. I don't know, when I hear you or say those words, it breaks my heart, but I'm glad that you are telling this story.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. So y'all donated the letters. And did you go to the university and read the letters, or did you donate the letters after? You kind of did some research.
Donated in 2008. They were archived there. Mm-hmm. So many of the letters, it's slightly too far from my camera for me to get to it now, but when I was working in Louisiana back in, the early 2000s, I photocopied all of the letters.
Oh, okay.
And I had written a master's thesis on it.
Right.
I had said what I thought was everything I wanted to say on Carville in my thesis. And then a friend of mine died a few years ago. And after his death, I just out of habit, I wake up and I write every morning. So just out of habit, I found myself waking up every morning, but not necessarily wanting to write. And so I thought I'd reread my thesis and ended up hating it.
Liz, how are the people putting their notes in here. You have several
Yeah,
people.
I'm gonna ask the question. So Ryan was asking about if you can explain a little bit more about the ostrich, and is that where they thought leprosy came from originally?
So yes, so
Thinking, right?
in order to protect so Corville is a city,
Right.
and the leprosarium was on a plantation inside the city. And so in order to protect the basically to protect the city and not lose value in property, somewhere someone decided in the city that that was an ostrich form
Oh, okay, okay.
leprosarium. Because if it was an ostrich form and they were breeding ostriches, that had more clout
Right.
and didn't bring down the property values, whereas obviously
Oh,
The
okay.
hospital
lepers,
would.
no one would have wanted to live in the city.
I have a question. First of all, thanks for opening up a window into like a time that few of us ever know about, let alone you think of.
Yeah.
What did the name? I know so many of the past diseases and ailments change names, of course, but where did they come up with Hansen's? Where does that come from? That name, which I think you said that's what it's called now.
Right, Hansen's disease. The scientist who discovers the bacteria was, I can't remember his first name now, but he was Hansen. And
Okay.
so that's where the name came. And in the 1920s and 30s, it was actually the patients at Carville, my great-grandfather included, and a more famous patient by the name of Stanley Stein, who wrote a book in the 60s and 70s. He wrote one version and then he revised it in the 70s. And it was called Alone No Longer. And he had advocated that the name be changed, that as long as it was called leprosy, you know, people just had a lot of biblical associations. They thought it was an ancient disease that, you know, no one knew about today. So he thought if you change the name, you know, it might improve the lives of patients. And quite honestly, it didn't, at least not in the way that he thought it would in the 50s.
I think it's
Oh,
wonderful.
Go ahead. Sorry, Karen.
That's all right. I just think it's wonderful that you have brought us this piece of history that could have been very easily lost, and given us a better understanding of what the people went through and how it relates to today.
Yes, thank you, Sharon.
You know, I always say that you have people in the history books, and I tell young people, but right in your own family, look how rich, you know, this story is. You know, all these big time publishing companies, they don't know about you, or, you know, what I'm just saying is that we need to come back into that, you know, that, let me see, you know, what was going 1920, you know, I mean, wow. I can't tell you enough how I feel honored, humble, and honored, you know, that you, um, I think it was bestowed on you, or you were destined, or you were anointed. It's all of that. You were the chosen one. That's what I'm saying. You were the chosen one to do this. You sound very compassionate, and I feel that you're very compassionate. And it took someone compassionate to do that, to do what you've done.
Right. To do the research
Thank
and
you.
to share. So, and Abigail said, I guess it's not so much a question, but really interesting, the kind of conflicting, contrasting feelings that, you know, that you kind of get from the letters
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
being there. Yeah.
Yes.
And then Karen saying it was, you know, so crazy that people feared these things, you know, and then to find out that it's one of the least you know, it's a disease that's not communicated, you know,
Right.
through whatever interaction or being near somebody or whatever.
I think basically it was contagious from fear.
Yeah,
Because people didn't know anything about it, and fear can really
play a major part.
absolutely turn your world upside down,
Yeah.
you know,
Right.
which is what it did back then to those poor people.
Yeah.
So do you know, is it still in existence?
So it is. In fact, that's what I was actually just about to say. So while there are fewer cases, like for instance, Dallas, I think, has only in the last several years had 2 or 3 cases. You know, so it's far less. There are still leprosariums. Officially, most leprosariums globally were closed. Unofficially, though, people with leprosy, you know, you can't go from being a leper in society one day to suddenly freed the next and everyone accept you. And so the reality is that even in Carville, for example, Carville closed back in the 90s, but the last patient to leave it, you know, did so 2015.
Mm.
And most patients, you know, just they die or they eventually become too sick to stay kind of independent, so they have to move into an assisted
So there is,
something
is there
like
still,
that.
is there still no cure?
So it is treatable now through a multi-drug therapy. Unfortunately, though, you know, you have to be able to afford the drugs.
No.
And so in any place, the United States or other, that you see, you know, leprosy, you know, disfigurements or things like that, you know, I read one scholar who pretty much said that really is a fault of the health system for failing those individuals.
Right, right. 'Cause it
Very interesting.
presents
Yeah.
itself in different ways too, doesn't it? Mostly
Right.
with lesions of the skin or swelling and
Right. Most people with it will just have, you know, I mean, it almost looks like a pimple or something.
mhm,
You know, you might even confuse it for acne, depending on where the blemish is. When you see people like who have lost limbs or fingers or anything like that, recognize that that is not necessarily leprosy. What a lot of patients will have, like in Carville, for instance, a lot of patients had diabetes and they had other ailments that caused amputations or infections. And because of those other ailments, you know, so leprosy it damages the nerves. So you know, their hands might be numb, so they're not feeling that they're burning themselves.
Mm.
And then of course, if they're diabetic or something, then they have a difficult time healing from the wound. So that can cause other infections. So
infections and stuff. Yeah,
the disease itself is not terminal, nor does it typically cause, you know, limbs to fall off.
right, right. Those were just missing communication or misinformation that people were
Right.
stories that were told.
And you
Although,
know what? Some people want to live in fear. They really want to live in fear than to take care of it. You know, just like Sharon said, you know, fear. This mind is something else. Once you put it up here, you know, you don't want to hear the truth.
right. Most of what we know about diabetes today actually comes from studies on the patients in Carville in
Wow.
the 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s. So many of them willingly participated in those
Studies,
Studies.
research
studies.
things. Yeah.
Studies.
So it was law that people were to be incarcerated in the early years in the early 1900s.
So from
That was-
1919 to about 19 to the 1940s, it was law that if you were diagnosed, you had to go to Corville. By the 1950s, you could be released for two reasons. One, you were quote unquote cured, which, you know, there is no cure, but you were treated. Or two, if you could prove you had financial means outside of Corville, then you could live outside. But you had to be independently wealthy enough because most people weren't going to hire you. So you had to show that you had a way of living, basically, fiscally. That ends up being a whole separate poem in my book.
Were the relatives afraid to take them in?
And then relatives were afraid to take them
Yeah,
in.
disowned him. There was a story
Yes.
in there about a father. This was it a daughter? Something I thought I read.
Right, there were stories in the letters, both that are archived and in my book, of you know, fathers disowning daughters. And
Well, what did they think it was? I mean, why would they disown them? Did they think it was their fault or something they had done to get this?
right, and so it could be different reasons. It could be, you know, some people thought it was like a curse by God.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Some people, depending on when they were born and their age, leprosy in the late 1800s was considered a sexually transmitted disease.
Wow.
So for instance, when Father Damien in Hawaii gets leprosy, that's a problem in the 1800s.
Mm.
Because at the time it was a sexually transmitted disease. So more than likely he had leprosy prior to entering the leprosarium, but hid that so that he could volunteer at the leprosarium. And then he claims to get it later, and he's made into a saint because, you know, he risks his life to live among the lepers. Well, he probably had the disease anyway. So
Do you know whether they the women, if they had it, that they made it that they could not you know, get pregnant or anything, or is there anything on that subject matter?
if a woman gave birth in Corville, I don't know that there was any kind of like sterilization or anything like that, but they did have to, if a woman gave birth, she had to give up the child. The child could not live in the leprosarium, and very rarely did family take child at a later, you know, take the child. And there is a kind of story like that in my book because my great-grandfather fell in love with a woman who had a child. Whether that child was his or not, we don't know. That's a dispute in my family. But he asks my great-grandmother, would you raise the child? And she flat out says no.
What happened to the children then? Is there an orphanage that would take them?
They were put into orphanages or, yeah. They became wards of the state.
Wards of the state, yeah.
That's sad that they never knew their parents, or their parents never got to raise them.
Right. One story that did not get in my book was one of the women that knew my family, and actually I met her in the early 2000s. She entered Corville in like 1930 or 1929. And when she entered it, she saw her sister. She had thought her sister had died.
Wow.
Earlier. She had been told her sister died. Her family had never told her, even after she was diagnosed with the disease. Her family never told her her sister was at Corville.
Wow.
So fascinating. This is a fascinating story.
Yeah.
This is really
Astonishing, but
fascinating.
so well done too, and so
Oh,
Yes.
yeah. You know, he's done his homework now. Well, he's a professor.
We're
Among
very
a lot
proud
of
of you.
professors, I should say, on this screen.
I'm glad to know you. I mean,
We're very proud of you, Josh.
yes, I'm proud.
Yes,
Yes.
thank you.
Because I want to ask him, I said, well, maybe we have to get out offline, but I think, you know, I'm such a crybaby. I just don't say, how were you able to get through that?
You know, um, I think I'm a person who I feel with words,
yeah,
and
obviously.
I don't necessarily, I'm not very visible in my emotion. So my sister, for example, can cry at, you know, any point. So I think that for me, I can write it and then I can process it and later say, wow, that's really sad. But it is, you know, for any number of reasons. For me, I think it's words are how I think, and they are how I express my feelings. So I think for me, I probably did not know to feel sad
Hmm.
until I wrote it.
Wow. That's good. That's good. Seeing it on paper. You wrote this. This is what happened. Oh my God, you know, and just making that connection.
Right.
And that's interesting that you said that because when I lived with my mother, I was going to journal. And when I wrote the first line, I said, too painful. I don't need to write this down because I don't want to come back and read it. Seriously. My professor told me to journal and I couldn't do it because I just don't think that I could have stood reading what all the stuff that happened and stuff on paper. So, you know, just let it happen. I think about it, all that, but I'm glad I didn't put it on paper.
Writing though is therapy for a lot of people.
Yeah.
It's a way to, like you say, to deal with things. But and the fact that you know, because you had to go and research. I mean, you went and researched the medical and the laws and you know all the other stuff too, didn't you?
Yes, I did.
Was that for your thesis, or was it
No,
just
for my
later?
thesis, I dealt almost solely with the letters. That was one difference between my thesis and this and writing
Right.
this book was basically that for this book, I did look more at the medical record because, you know, I think in part just I was older and, you know, when I read their medical record initially in my late teens and early 20s, I probably thought, oh, this is just too sad and that's so depressing. And they had all these ailments. And then I reread the letters, you know, in my late 30s, early 40s. And I suddenly said, well, you know, I have this, I have that. Suddenly that doesn't look so terrible.
Right.
I'm not as sad.
Maybe you were more emotionally ready
So I was
to
right.
leave, listen, and read as you
Right.
got older.
So did
Yes,
y'all?
that's a far better way of saying it.
So did your mother inherit? Who inherited the letters, or was it your grandmother that great grandmother?
Ultimately, so after after the last relative died, they ended up with my great grandmother and particularly with a cousin.
Uh-huh.
And then in the 1990s, I asked for the letters to be brought back to Louisiana. My cousin lived out of state.
Oh, okay. Yeah, that's great. That's great that y'all have that and that they're available, that they're there. So it's a part of the collection, so you can go there and to the university and
Yes,
review or look at or see. Yeah, that's great.
See you touring with this. I
yes.
do. And again, you know, I'm not going to leave myself out of this. You're not going to get rid of me. I can see myself. I can see myself in the middle of a stage and somehow in the back, there's some words and pictures, and then I start speaking. Not the whole book. And then, but I kind of see you there too, like to the side or whatever,
Yeah.
you're not going to get rid of me, sir.
Well, we've gone over a little bit, but I think everybody was glad to do that. So we
Yeah.
appreciate Josh so much. Christopher Lee Maines, Naming the Leper. If you want to look that up, it's on Amazon. You can find that. It's wonderful, and you want to read the rest of the letters. Next week, we will have Janice Robinson will be here. Her pen name is Jean Maxwell, and she's going to be reading Winter Symphony, I think. Karen says, so proud of you, Chris. Ryan says, great job. And you said thanks to everybody. So
Good job. Well
so
done.
thank you very much for joining us tonight. We appreciate all of y'all being here. If you'll come back next Tuesday for Janice, the week after that, Sharon will be reading Jake, Homeless to Hero, a children's book. And so we'll just keep this going. But if all of us invite one person next time, we'll just keep growing. So we appreciate it so much. Y'all have a great evening, and we'll see you next Tuesday.
Night,
Okay.
everybody.
Buddy.
Bye-bye.
Bye,
Jason,
everyone.
Jay, is that a real fireplace behind you? Is that?
Oh, it is. That's a real one.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
wow, that's
If I'm
very
gonna
you-
do a fake, if I'm gonna do a fake scene, it's gonna be a beach.
Okay.
Palm trees swaying in the wind.
All right. Y'all
Have a
take
good
care.
evening, everybody.
Good night.
Liz, I'll give you a call.
Okay.
Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye.
Have a good one. Thank you, Liz.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, Liz, for all that you do.